Leaders are frantically getting to as many marginal seats as they can. It'll all be over in, well, 4 days from now. Let's bring in Peter Hartcher, political editor with the Sydney Morning Herald. Peter, very good afternoon to you. Let's start with the debate over the last couple of days over the new policy announced from Scott Morrison on Sunday at the campaign launch. There hasn't been a lot of new policies from the government in this, and maybe that's a reason why he put this out there on Sunday. Look, there's not a lot of debate between the government and Labor on this because Shorten rubber stamped it, lickety-split. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean it's a good policy. What do you think of this idea that the taxpayer should start guaranteeing home loans?
Well, I think it's shoddy policy. I think it's junk policy. And it's junk policy. Doesn't matter how many political parties support it. It's still a bad idea. I mean, you can see the government's incentive. Obviously, it's a concession by the government that they need to shore up support, particularly among younger voters, people who are worried about being able to ever afford to buy a house, but it's also a concession that their parents, the next generation up, is also worried on their behalf. But what it effectively does, and we know this, David, from many years in many countries now where subsidies are introduced into a housing market, particularly for one segment. In this case, it would be first home buyers earning $125,000 a year or less. So if you give them effectively a subsidy of, let's say, $30,000, $40,000, sellers know that. So everybody selling in that category will immediately capitalise that into their expectation of the sale price. So effectively, you're just pushing up the market price collectively for that entire group by the same amount as the subsidy. So those people are chasing an ever-receding horizon. Yeah.
We should point out that they said on Sunday this would only apply to 10,000 a year. There are about 112,000, I think, first home buyers a year. So, you know, 1 in 11 are lucky enough to get this. We don't know how they would be chosen. Who would be the lucky recipients of this taxpayer support?
Well, this is one of the problems with it. So Scott Morrison has sort of conceded today that the effect of the subsidy could be to push, I think the expression he used was to firm up real estate prices. So that's a concession that, yes, maybe, yes, that's right, it would push up the price. So he's conceding effectively the point I just made. But Labor makes the opposite point and says that, oh, it's so small and with only 10,000 a year, it's not significant and we don't think it's material. Well, hang on. So if it's pushing the price up, as Scott Morrison says it's doing, then it's self-defeating policy and it doesn't help the first home buyers in that category. If Labor's right, and it's so small and with such a small number of applicants, that successful applicants, according to, as you say, who knows what criterion, if it's so trivial, then why do it? It's not actively, you know, transforming the prospects for a whole category of that generation of voters who can't afford housing. It's just trivia. It's tokenism. So either way, according to the rhetoric of either party, it's junk policy.
Who would have thought in the final days of a very tight election contest, politics would triumph over good, sound policy decision-making on both sides?
David, Peter, I was reminded of the Kevin Rudd last-minute desperation promise to move Garden Island Naval Base from Sydney Harbour to North Queensland. So this isn't quite as bad as that. It's not quite as zany, but it's in the same category, last-minute brainwaves.
There's been some crackers. I remember Kevin Rudd doing the special tax zone for Darwin or the Northern Territory as well. Anyway, look, we've seen today Bill Shorten go after Scott Morrison over his religious views. Look, the Prime Minister did leave this open yesterday when asked. Look, the background of this has been bubbling away in the background of the election campaign, or away from the election campaign. The footballer Israel Folau's social media post about, you know, gays are going to hell. So it finds its way into some questions to both leaders, and Bill Shorten's, you know, we saw in fact at the debate last week said he's not even sure hell exists. Scott Morrison was not very clear in his answer yesterday on whether he agreed with Israel Folau. Today, Bill Shorten says, well, you know, he should really clear this up immediately. He has now. Was this fair, do you think, for the opposition leader to raise?
Well, it's pretty cheeky, especially because it's not currently on any ballot paper. That is a matter, a policy and political matter that's been resolved. The plebiscite was clear and the law has changed. So it's pretty cheeky to bring up a non-issue like that a couple of days out from an election and try to exploit the Prime Minister's known religious personal conviction. So it's, you know, as you say, David, who would have thunk it? You get just before an election campaign and high morals and good policy aren't necessarily top priority.
Yeah, all right. What about where you think things are at in this final week? We saw some polls yesterday. Do you think either side does have momentum into the crucial final few days?
Well, the evidence that we've got is both sketchy and inadequate to actually, give a convincing, uniform answer. The anecdotal, so the closest example we have in from recent polling is the news poll data today, which does the state comparisons over the course of the campaign. And according to that, the picture is very mixed. According to that, you've got New South Wales improving. You've got both New South Wales improving for the Liberal Party, while you've got Victoria improving for the Labor Party. You've got older people and women, older people and men moving towards the Labor Party. It's a real dog's breakfast. And the sample size for any one of those state samples is over 3 percentage points. So it's very hard to actually be sure. On the national overall level, there may have been a snugging of 1 percentage point in the coalition's favour in the course of the last month. But again, that is within the margin of error of all the polls. Interesting, there are no polls going the other direction, showing an overall national movement to the Labor Party. So if there is any movement, it does seem to have been to the coalition, but it's so small that you really, it's faith over evidence to say that the coalition has actual momentum. And if you look at the way that the coalition is campaigning and where they're campaigning, it's quite defensive, and it suggests that they're certainly not anywhere near confident of being able to win.
Yeah, and look, the old cliche is right. It'll come down to the seat-by-seat contest rather than the national result. It's what happens in those clutch of marginal seats. Look, final one, Peter, because we saw the Prime Minister just asked about it now. The US-China trade dispute, trade war is deepening. Their talks have clearly gone right off the rails. Friday, Trump announces a whole raft of new tariffs on Chinese goods. Now China's retaliated. Markets around the world, including our own, have been affected by this. Trump's threatening even more. Where is this going? Does it suggest they've simply failed to make any progress in their trade talks?
Well, according to Donald Trump, the Chinese had made promises and were backtracking on the implementation of them. But the overall picture here, I think, David, is that Donald Trump thinks he is winning this trade war, and politically within the US, he is winning the trade war at the moment. That's not necessarily going to continue as the pain goes up, but he thinks he's winning and he's going to continue to prosecute it. Now, the big picture problem here for Australia and for any country that's not a superpower, David, is that this is the leading rule-making nation for the last 70 years, the trade liberaliser and the rule maker, which has now thrown aside any pretense that rules matter at all, and this is purely a might is right campaign. It's the law of the jungle where we are bigger and we have more market power, and we're going to force you to an accommodation on our terms. Now, that may, from this distance, that looks interesting and, OK, it's all very academic. But what this does is that it legitimises whether it's going to be the Chinese, which is quite likely, or the Americans, which is also possible, coming to Australia and making demands. If you have the Chinese making demands on Australia over a political matter or a strategic matter, and prepared to use economic coercion against us to enforce that, or if you've got the Americans want some commercial advantage and want to use their trade might against Australia, there is no recourse, and we have to now expect that will happen to us, and we have to be prepared that we're going to have to accept economic pain without recourse to rules or any umpire from either of those countries, or indeed any country that thinks it's bigger and more powerful than we are.
It's a very good point, Peter, that this essentially means international trade rules are breaking down.
This is chaos, and it's chaos according to the principle that the rules-based order was always supposed to address. Without order, there are no rules. So, you can slice and dice the minutiae of this, how Australia could lose, and there's a number of ways in detail that we could lose from the specifics of this particular agreement or non-agreement. And, of course, what Donald Trump has tweeted over the weekend is that he thinks this could be just the beginning. He said any company that wants to avoid US tariffs, all you need to do is take your operations and move them and put them inside the US. So he's advocating a total realignment of global supply lines, investment, manufacturing. He's advocating the dislocation of the entire economic arrangement that's been put in place painstakingly over 70 years. So that's the course he's heading on.
Yeah,
this is
and that's the
dramatic
big
stuff.
picture. Yeah.
Yes, and even if it doesn't go that far, the sheer abandonment of any attempt at rules and the assertion of might is right is a big problem for any country that, like us, is not a superpower.
Peter Hartcher, political editor with the Sydney Morning Herald, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We'll catch up soon.